The day I got my husband's diagnosis, he suddenly installed a camera in the master bedroom. That night, I saw him swear over the phone saying, "I won't touch her again. I've sent you the account's password. You can log in and check anytime." I decided to stay faithful for love. Watching his passionate, flushed face, I quietly put the diagnosis sheet into the shredder. Stay faithful for love. Sure, let's do that for a lifetime. When I saw ASL on Ken's diagnosis, I nearly collapsed. 3 months ago, Ken had a fall while hiking, and during his hospital stay, I had asked the doctor for a full checkup to put my mind at ease. I didn't expect to get results like this. There's currently no cure for ALS. Medication can only slow it down, but the end is inevitable. The doctor looked at me with sympathy. Ken is in his early 30s, handsome, successful, and strong. He's a well-known divorce lawyer, sharp and decisive, a top-tier professional. Privately, he's simple, disciplined, into fitness and hiking, very particular about life quality. Imagining someone like him becoming a dependent ALS patient is unimaginable for me. Sitting by the street, watching the crowds pass by, I stood up after a while. I knew what I needed to do. Being married means sticking together through thick and thin. No matter how he changes, I will face it with him and our son. By the time I got home, it was dark. My son Ethan was quietly playing Go in his room. At 7, he's already at a 5 Dan level, and was even interviewed as a prodigy by TV. "Have you eaten?" I asked softly, adjusting my mood. "Yeah, the maid made rib and lotus root soup today," he replied, focused on his game. "And Dad?" "Went running." Ethan is quiet and straightforward, just like us. 2 hours later, as I rested in bed, wondering whether to tell Ken about his condition, he returned. He was in black workout gear, looking bold and composed. I felt anxious. It's freezing outside. Why is he wearing so little? One of the doctor's reminders for ALS is that muscle shrinkage reduces heat. He can't get cold. It could speed up the progression. Without expression, Ken quietly said, "This is how I run," and started setting up a camera opposite the bed. I was puzzled. Why a camera suddenly? There were burglaries nearby. Cameras make it safer. "Aren't you worried about privacy?" I hesitated, knowing Ken's big on personal privacy. With a dismissive glance, he said, "Privacy? Who'd be interested in yours?" Caught in mixed emotions, I chose not to argue. At bedtime, he lay facing away, distantly, clearly exhausted and uninterested in talking. I sighed inwardly. He'd just wrapped up a high-profile divorce case. Letting go of that stress would need some rest. In the middle of the night, uneasy feelings woke me up. The space beside me was empty. Ken was gone. I worriedly got up to find him. Standing on the balcony, in just pajamas, he whispered on the phone in the cold night air. "I won't touch her again," he murmured, stopping me in my tracks. "I've sent you the password and account. You can log in and check anytime. I've decided to stay faithful for love." Through the glass, I stared at Ken. His usually cold and indifferent face was flushed with a strong emotion. Watching him, I was shocked, rethinking the logic in his words. It was like seeing a stranger. Ken has a strong sexual appetite. Restrained during the day, demanding at night. In the last few years, his pressure spiked. He had to be meticulous, leaving nothing overlooked, and began living in a closed-off state. Only in those intimate moments at night, when his breathing warmed my ear, could I find the boyishness that once blushed at the sight of me. "Vemet in He pursued me. An aloof boy, his eyes burned only for me, his voice trembling. I fell fast. I stayed at school to teach psychology, while he climbed the legal ladder to become a nationwide renowned divorce lawyer, earning millions per year. In personality, we're alike. Emotionally stable, practical, logical, valuing quality life, willing to strive for our dreams. I had a stable, respectable career balance with family life. He was soaring in his career. 8 years married. We were respectful and supportive, owning a spacious condo and having a genius son. An enviable family, truly. But half a year ago he changed. He always had a night-run habit. It used to be leaving at 8 p.m., back by 9 p.m. After a shower, he'd spend half an hour with family, never disrupted. But suddenly, he left at 7, returned at 10, often exhausted, and went straight to bed, skipping family time. When I asked why the longer runs, he said, lips tight. Cases are tough. I need more time to think. Mental work tires more than physical. I understood. Later, he seemed to suddenly lose interest in sex. I thought pressure affected him physically. Not wanting to hurt his pride, I stayed quiet but worried. After his injury and hospital stay, I urged him to take a break for recovery and requested a full checkup. But clearly, things didn't turn out as I imagined. Lying back in bed, eyes wide in the dark, staring at the ceiling, his words sounded foreign to me. The expressions on his face felt unreal. After mentally enduring 2 blows today, my curiosity surprisingly overshadowed the sadness and anger I expected to feel. I was really curious. What kind of woman was on the other end of the line? She had transformed Ken, who had become extremely cold and rational over the years. How did she do that? I'm usually straightforward in my actions. The next night, I slipped some sleeping pills into his milk. He slept like a log, and I grabbed his phone, unlocking it with his finger. I found the number from the late-night call and stared at it for a long time until something clicked in my brain. I'd seen that number before. 3 months ago, after Ken fell and got injured while hiking and was hospitalized, I got the contact info of the person who first called the cops to help him. It was a way to say thank you. The police had given me the same number. I've got a pretty sharp memory, especially for numbers. I wasn't wrong. I called the number right in front of the police, and a woman answered. Her voice was gentle and kind, but you could tell she was older. She kindly refused to meet, saying thanks weren't necessary, as it was something any decent person would do. After hanging up, the cop told me with a chuckle that while some people would ask for a reward, she wouldn't. I asked why. He said he recognized her during questioning. She'd been featured in the news as a strong and beautiful woman. Apparently, she was pretty unlucky in love. Her husband had a sudden brain hemorrhage at their wedding, leaving him fully paralyzed. With a 7-year-old son from a previous marriage, she never abandoned him, taking care of him for 13 years and raising the child solo. Her husband passed away last year, and she'd started a small stand selling lamb stew at a park. Someone with morals like hers wouldn't accept a reward. At the time I nodded, thinking how lucky my husband was to have met her. Now late at night, I sat with his phone in my hand for a long while before opening the photo album. I wasn't sure if Ken was overly confident or just trusted me completely, but he barely hid anything. The whole screen was filled with photos of one woman, the same woman over and over. Under a starry night, a small food stand lit up warmly, steam rising up. The woman had a gentle appearance and a bright smile, sometimes slicing things, sometimes serving soup, sometimes chatting with customers. Every photo was peaceful, filled with warmth and a sense of bliss. Dozens of photos showed her shifting from a short-sleeved dress to a thick coat. It had been 6 months. On the 3rd day, I went to the park and sat by her lamb soup stand. I watched the woman, Betty, as she crouched by a flower bed, talking sweetly to a stray kitten. 2 guys standing by her booth joked, "Betty only has eyes for these little fur balls and doesn't even care about making money anymore." Betty quickly stood up and explained softly, "Sorry, they just look so pitiful. And I got carried away. Didn't see you guys there." The other guy waved a dismissive hand. "You're just being kind. These strays see your place as home. They know you've got a soft heart." After those guys left, I walked over. "I'll have a bowl of lamb stew," Betty acknowledged with a laugh and started serving me. I quietly observed her through the steam. She seemed about 35 or 36, with fine lines at the corners of her eyes. Though not as youthful as a young girl, her features were soft and graceful. Her hair was tied in a low ponytail, with loose strands falling, giving her a unique feminine grace. "First time here, huh? I'll give you some extra lamb lung." I sat down and slowly tasted the soup while pondering a question. Could someone like Betty, with her background and character, really get involved in someone else's marriage? Could she? Suddenly, Betty took a seat across from me. I blinked in surprise. She smiled warmly, her eyes bright. "You're Ken the lawyer's wife, right?" I put my spoon down and looked at her quietly. "You know me then?" She smiled. "I have a good memory. Just once I saw your photo on Ken's phone, and I recognized you." I frowned, recalling that Ken used to have a wallpaper of me and our son on his phone. He only changed it to some scenic picture about 6 months ago. Her eyes lowered, and after a moment she spoke softly. I know why you're here. You probably think there's something between me and Lawyer Ken, right? I stayed silent. She looked up slowly with warmth and sincerity. Sis, believe me, there isn't. Ken and I are clean. He just comes by for soup after jogging. She paused, a bit of worry crossing her face. Later, I noticed he seemed down while having soup. Didn't talk much, seemed stressed. I tried to comfort him a few times, and he might have misunderstood. She shrugged slightly. Sure, he said some crazy stuff, but he's got a family. Even if he were single, someone like him wouldn't be interested in someone like me. She continued. I told him it was a spur-of-the-moment thing, but he didn't listen. He kept pushing, calling me with absurd things sometimes. You didn't come to me, but I was planning to talk to you myself. Lawyer Ken must be stressed out, and you as his wife could probably help. I watched the soup's top curdle and harden. So what you're saying is, all this is Ken's wishful thinking, and you've been rejecting him? Betty sighed again, nodding slowly. I looked up, locking eyes with her. So the camera he set up in the master bedroom for you to watch, was that also his impulsive idea? Betty froze for a second before replying. I already told him that was out of line, totally irresponsible. I pressed on. And the hiking trip you two went on, when he carried you and ended up falling, that wasn't against your will either. Betty's eyes widened slightly as she stood abruptly. Hiking? I have no clue what you're talking about. I stared coldly at her. Didn't you say you had a good memory? I even called you to thank you back then. You forgot so soon. Just then, a customer shouted for a large order to go. Betty pursed her lips and hurried to the stand, stiffly grabbing a ladle to serve the soup. Suddenly there was a loud crash. The pot full of hot lamb soup toppled over. Steaming soup and lamb innards spilled everywhere. The hot soup splashed on her, and Betty let out a scream, her eyes instantly reddening. A customer cursed and dodged away, calling it bad luck, and left grumbling. I looked at the mess before me, not wanting to get involved. I picked up my bag to leave. She, with tear-filled eyes, suddenly shouted out, Sorry. I stopped, frowning as I looked at her. She stood there, looking pitiful and whimpering softly. Sorry. I really did keep it from you that day. I was upset about my stepson getting into a fight, and he just happened to come by, suggesting that a hike might make me feel better. So I went. After he fell down the mountain, I was so scared. I called Kathy but didn't dare see you. I was afraid you'd overthink it. Her eyes were red and tears fell one by one as her hands, splashed with the hot soup, had several blisters, looking miserably pitiful. Kathy, what are you doing? A loud shout came from behind. I turned to see Ken running over with a face full of anger, and for a second, I was stunned. It's been ages since I've seen such strong emotions on his face. He was wearing the blue suit he only wore during formal negotiations, which meant he rushed here from somewhere important. Back in the day, even if I had a car accident and called him, he would finish the negotiation before rushing to the hospital. Ken glanced at the mess on the floor, and then at the quietly sobbing Betty, tightly pursed his lips and walked step by step to her side. He bent down, looking silently at the helpless woman, and suddenly pulled her into his arms. Are you okay? Did she hurt you? Betty buried her face in his chest, and suddenly burst into tears, crying out her grievances. Ken closed his eyes in pain and said softly, Don't cry. Betty, don't cry. Remember your favorite saying? The light boat has sailed past 10,000 mountains. Your hardship is over, completely over. There's nothing worth shedding a tear for anymore. Throughout it all, Ken didn't look at me once. I took out my phone and snapped a few photos of them. The camera's click was crisp and clear. Betty jerked away from Ken's embrace, stepping back with an expression of regret and helplessness, realizing only just then what she had done. She looked at me in panic, trying to explain. I forgot, I didn't mean to. But she couldn't continue, because I just stared at her indifferently. You don't need to say a word. I'll handle this. Ken interrupted her in a deep voice, turning to look at me, instantly restoring his usual calm and composed persona, like the imposing lawyer he is. Kathy, let's discuss this at home. This place is close to your university. Lots of students come and go. Making a scene here isn't good for you. Plus, he glanced at the mess on the ground. Is it fun bullying a helpless woman? I looked at him coldly, speaking evenly. You know, there are many students of mine coming and going here. As my husband, hugging a widow like it's on fire. How exciting is that for you? Ken's eyes narrowed, angry yet a tad shocked. After all, I've always been the gentle, elegant, and composed one in front of him. This side of me was something he'd never seen. Even I hadn't seen this side of myself before. Although I'd be justified in slapping both of you, no one's blaming me for anyone else's actions. I turned to Betty, who was quietly cleaning up. Miss Betty, since you're not speaking, are you planning to do so? She shivered, then slowly lifted her chin a few seconds later and said loudly, Forget it. Stop arguing. I knocked it over myself, all right? She looked at Ken with red eyes, aggrieved. Lawyer Ken, please leave with your wife and don't disrupt my business anymore. I won't be doing business with you, and please don't come again. Nearby, customers began to gather. What happened here? How did it end up like this? Betty, is someone bothering you? Who dares bother Betty? I won't stand for it. Various unfriendly glances fell on me. Ken's gaze darkened, and he pulled me toward the parking lot. I couldn't break free and had no choice but to follow along. Familiar students came walking with a ball in hand, cheerfully greeting me. Hello, Miss Kathy. I nodded with a smile. Hello. In the parking lot, I forcefully shook off his hand and calmly walked to my car. The trees on both sides swiftly retreated as I drove on the avenue. Tears that I couldn't hold back anymore began to fall. I gave myself half an hour. Anger, pain, acceptance, calm. Then I turned the steering wheel and headed to the bank. Ken and I have a joint family account where our wages, bonuses, and earnings go. When we opened it, he joked with me. Haven't you always complained I don't express myself? This account will be under your care. I'll just keep depositing money into it, as you're in our son's future security. Is this kind of expression satisfactory? Over the years, it has accumulated over 18 million. The bank staff confusingly told me, this account is frozen due to guarantee default. You didn't know? I felt a chill spreading through my limbs and slowly asked, when did this happen? 2 months ago. 2 months ago. Right after he had just recovered and was discharged. I fell ill from exhaustion taking care of him, with a high fever for a week. So when I was feverish and disoriented, he was prepping to gain the upper hand on the divorce and property fight. I felt both ridiculous and funny. On the way here, I even regretted being too impulsive and showing my cards too soon without planning my retreat. But it turns out he had already started plotting against me. Men sure can be cold-hearted once they're out of love. When I got home, it was dark. Ken sat on the sofa in his lounge wear, sipping tea with a calm expression. He glanced at me. Ethan's at my mom's. Let's get everything sorted out tonight. I sat down, silently watching him. He took a sip of tea and slowly began to speak. I originally planned to talk about this later. After all, I do have some remorse and wanted you both to enjoy happiness for a little longer. Since you've decided to stir things up today, I'll just go along with it. Kathy, I've fallen for someone else. Let's get a divorce. I was surprisingly calm, even giving him a slight smile. Ken, can you tell me why you love her so much that you're willing to betray 10 years of our relationship, abandoning me and our child? He frowned slightly. If you must know. After a brief silence, he began speaking slowly in a gentle and emotional tone. These past few years, because of my work, I've seen a lot of deceit in marriages. I've lost my ability to understand or judge feelings in marriage. But after meeting her, I realized that women like her exist. She's willing to sacrifice the best years of her life just for love and responsibility. She brought life to my heavy and suffocating existence. You ask why I love her? I've asked myself countless times too. Because she's gentle, kind, and strong. Life gave her hardships, yet she blooms stubbornly in the mud. Because every cold night, she'd hand me a bowl of hot soup. His face was full of emotion, seemingly touched by his own words. The room fell silent. After a while, I let out a soft chuckle. So the soup Auntie makes isn't hot enough? You had to try something outside. Ken tensed up, and his face immediately turned cold. Kathy, you're a self-centered individualist. You'll never understand this kind of love. I nodded. If that's the case, leave with nothing, and I'll agree to the divorce. A look of obvious disdain appeared on his face. Let's not mention that leaving with nothing doesn't even exist legally. And I haven't done anything with Betty. I'm not even at fault. I stared at him in silence. Can a person really change so completely? Becoming heartless as if they've swapped souls overnight. Ken seemed to guess what I was thinking and furrowed his brow. There's no need for this. If the love's gone, then divorce is the logical step. When I was waiting for rescue on the mountain, I figured it out. Life is short, and I don't want to live in fear of loving. Even if it means facing criticism, I want to truly live once. Kathy, don't forget what I do. I have plenty of ways to handle this, but it depends on whether I want to use them on you. I laughed quietly. Not using them on me? You already have, haven't you? Playing dirty tricks like freezing accounts. Doesn't that desecrate your pure love? Ken glanced at me, speaking calmly. Looks like you checked the accounts. It's nothing, just standard procedure to avoid complications in the divorce. I've drafted the divorce agreement. I'll keep the money and the kid. The house is yours. Of course, you'll have to handle the remaining mortgage yourself. Considering the financial contributions to the family, I believe this is already quite generous. I picked up the ashtray from the table and hurled it at him. He clutched his forehead. Bright red blood seeped through his fingers. You're crazy. He looked both shocked and angry, taking the car keys and running out without looking back. I slowly sat down, poured myself a cup of tea. In just 3 days, my life was turned upside down. After leaving the bank, I realized that Ken finally used those well-practiced tactics on me. I guess I was more unlucky than other women, not only dealing with betrayal, but also because my husband is a professional divorce lawyer. He had long mastered a cold and calculated way of dealing with things, always driven by self-interest. If I stayed in ineffective sorrow and pain, I'd be left with nothing. I had to handle this the way he would, so before returning home, I had already picked up Ethan from his grandma's and left him with a trusted go-teacher. Silently, I drank cup after cup of tea. Outside, somehow, a bright moon quietly hung in the sky. After a while, I stood up, walked into the room, and took out the diagnosis report. My phone vibrated. Ken sent me a photo. In the picture, his forehead was bandaged as he lay with his eyes closed on a woman's lap. Their hands were tightly clasped together. Below it was a line of text. Since you don't cherish him, I feel no guilt. Your actions helped me finally decide to accept him. It was both an announcement and a blatant provocation. People who emerge from life's dire straits have seen all types of ugliness in the world. How could she be a flower in the mud? She knocked over the hot pot on purpose that afternoon. When I was about to leave, she stopped me with an apology, also intentional, because she had notified Ken in advance to come. Ken sees benefits clearly, but misses understanding people's hearts. Men can be so shameless. I whispered, placing the diagnosis report into the shredder. As it whirred, my mind settled. Yes, what I'm facing is a wonderfully kind woman and a renowned divorce lawyer. But I am going to fight this battle. The divorce will definitely happen. I will fight for my son and money. More importantly, I'll make sure this hopelessly lovesick couple remains tightly bound together, unable to part even in death. Just when you think the worst is over, I'll teach you, there's always another hurdle. I'll reject Ken's divorce proposal. As a professional divorce lawyer, he'd never want his own divorce to go to court. It indicates he can't negotiate a settlement, damaging his professional image. I'm not in a rush. Maybe not in a rush, but certainly not as rushed as they are. In Ken's eyes, Betty is sanctified and pure. If she makes any move before they establish an official relationship, her image would have a blemish. So she had no choice but to play hard to get. And when necessary, put on a righteous front that screamed morality and kindness. As for Ken, amid the chaos of the divorce, he couldn't afford to be the one at fault. So both of them just bottled it up. The most he did was stop by Betty's stand after his nightly run to grab a bowl of lamb offal soup. Lamb offal soup. I held a steaming cup of tea, watching the gentle snowfall outside. The doctor had said that for someone with ALS, avoiding cold and high-purine foods is crucial, or it could speed up the disease. And the high-purine foods mainly are animal organs. After staying at the company for a week, Ken came back. He walked in silently while I was cleaning up. A band-aid on his forehead. his face cold and unyielding as he moved straight to the bedroom. He quickly packed a suitcase and then, glancing at me, said coldly, "I was going to leave the house to you, but you've drained our relationship dry. So, we'll just go by the law. The bank account's frozen. Our main shared asset is this house. Are you selling it to give me half, or paying me in cash?" I tossed an album into a box and chuckled. "What? Betty's got her eyes on this house now?" Ken scoffed. "Do you think everyone's as greedy as you? Betty never mentioned money to me. Don't insult her." His eyes suddenly narrowed at something, and he walked over to pick it up, the photo album. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Throwing out trash." His face showed anger that quickly turned to ice. This album was familiar to him. It was full of our college photos, from candid shots to meeting and falling in love. I once kept it like a treasure in a safe, saying it'll be nice to look at when we're old. I took it back from him without expression and tossed it aside. A thud broke the silence in the room. "Aren't you going for a run? It's about time, isn't it?" I reminded him. His face twisted, standing there with silence. Then he turned sharply and said, "Ethan's hiding doesn't help. He's my son, and being with me is best for his future. I won't give up on him." With that, he slammed the door and left. Half an hour later, I clapped the dust off my hands and sighed. Everything related to him was packed, just waiting to be tossed out. Memories I once cherished. And that's about it. As I was reflecting, my phone buzzed. A young laid-back voice came through. "This is Dave. You looking for me?" I looked at the carefree guy in front of me, chewing gum with swag. Purple hair, lip ring, cold eyes, quite the look. But on a closer look, he wore just a thin cotton jacket, the sleeves frayed and the zipper stitched with black thread, like some DIY job. I got straight to it. "You're Dave? Betty's stepson?" He eyed me, saying nothing. I handed him a wad of cash. "My husband's leaving me because of her. I need your help." "Deal." He swept the cash up casually. I was surprised at his quick agreement. "You're taking my word for it?" "Why not?" he said while chewing. "She worked hard raising you." Dave flicked his gum, eyes holding contempt. "She didn't raise us so much as she enjoyed looking good to others." I studied him, handing him more money. He grabbed it, speaking on. "I've played piano since I was 4. Dad saved for lessons, but she donated it all to the Red Cross. Told reporters other kids couldn't even eat. Our struggle was nothing. Know how my dad died? Bed sores got infected, till he passed. Sure, she took care of us, but only on the surface. You said she seduced your husband, doesn't surprise me. She lures fools, but folks like you are a first." As Dave left, clutching his cash, he asked, "So just push her to make him divorce you? That simple?" I nodded. "That simple. Got it. But divorce isn't enough. It has to go my way." I needed a two-pronged approach. The next day, I returned to Betty's lamb soup stand amid a light snowfall. Betty was kneeling in the snow, tying shoelaces for an old man with a cane. Everyone around was giving her thumbs up. "Whoever marries someone like you is one lucky guy." Betty stood up, embarrassed, saying, "With my circumstances, who'd want me?" Turning, she met my eyes and her face drained. With pursed lips, she walked up to me, chin slightly raised. "Ken's lawyer said if you dare touch me, he'll help me sue you." I lowered my gaze, then looked up again, fury boiling, face twisted, all agitated. "Betty, what did that text mean? Are you and him together? You afraid I'll blow this up and ruin you?" Betty squinted at me for a moment, then chuckled, shaking her head with a sigh. "I used to think university professors were out of reach, so amazing. But now, you're just like any street troublemaker." She looked at me with this gentle, pitying gaze. "How you see the world reflects your heart." I accepted him, because he laid his heart before me. Any woman would be moved by such sincerity. Ken's an outstanding man, burdened by stress, yet not a bit of warmth from home. You never appreciated him. But I'm not as sordid as you think. Despite reluctantly agreeing, I won't have anything with him while he's married. I'm me. If he comes, I'm here. If he doesn't, I'm still here. That's it. I shouted. "Don't think I don't know what you're up to. You're just after his money, aren't you? Why else would he fight me for the assets in the divorce?" She smiled faintly, seemingly uninterested in arguing with me. Everyone knew that Betty, never cared about money. Otherwise, I could have married into wealth countless times over the past 13 years. The only thing that moves me is sincerity. I sneered, dripping with sarcasm. Nice speech. If he loves you so much, why doesn't he hurry up and divorce me to marry you? It only means he values money more than you. Betty's calm face suddenly looked unsettled. His sincerity, I know it in my heart. I laughed triumphantly. Sincerity? Let him walk away with nothing if you've got the guts. If he's willing to give up his money to be with you, then I'll believe he truly loves you. Otherwise, it's just nonsense. Just an excuse for affairs. Betty's cheeks twitched, her lips pressed tightly for a while. She looked at me word by word. And if he can do it? I shamelessly raised my voice. Then I'll personally congratulate you at your wedding. Everyone will know that even his ex-wife is moved by your love. Betty, your image will be even more radiant. Betty's eyes glimmered in the light of my dramatic words. I knew. Her endorphins and dopamine were kicking in. The city was hit by days of heavy snow, roads blocked. Betty's stall was temporarily closed. But nothing could hold back lovebirds and heat. Ken used his routine of wanting lamb soup as an excuse, braving snow and wind to walk half an hour to Betty's for soup every evening. The trek just made their meetings more intense and passionate. Sitting at the table, Betty tended to only him. They'd exchange smiles, creating a warm, charming scene. I saw it all through the camera. A couple of days ago, Dave sent me a receipt for reimbursement. I asked for what? Annoyed, he said, "Don't make me spell it out. I bought a camera to spy. Watch it yourself. It's Dad's house anyway. I'll do what I want." I hesitated a bit, then agreed. Ken, usually so calculating, was like a fiery adolescent fool around Betty. Know your enemy, keep control. Besides, it's just using his trick back on him. One day, as Betty and Ken enjoyed their soup love fest, Dave stormed in. "Oh, so you're the man on the side?" Their faces dropped. Betty hurried to calmly explain, while Ken muttered about just being a guest for soup. Dave snorted. "Soup every day in this weather? What's the big deal anyway? Just admit it, being together ain't bad. It's just plain human stuff." Then he skeptically eyed Ken. "Are you a scam artist?" Ken's face darkened. "I'm a lawyer." "So you're married already?" Ken paled. "I come for the soup." Dave exploded. "So you're sneaking around with my stepmom? Get lost. Married and messing with widows? I'll pound you." He lunged and Betty shrieked, pulling him back. The door was ajar. Nosy neighbors crowded around. They chimed in, warning Betty not to be duped, recalling past scams. Betty just smiled, explaining Ken was indeed just here for soup, and Dave misunderstood. After the incident, Ken, mindful of the reputational damage, stopped visiting daily. Even on those occasional visits, he acted all sneaky. Their infrequent encounters grew heavy with longing, their eyes meeting like magnets. I sent Ken a draft for divorce. He only replied with 3 words, "No way." Then one day, I saw via the camera Betty telling Ken she was leaving town. Ken was stunned. "Why?" With tears, Betty said, "Dave's grown. It's inappropriate for us to live like this. No home here for me. I've got a widower to meet back home. No way. No man can deserve you like that." Ken shouted furiously, "Only marry me." Betty wept. "You're married. I won't destroy a family. Let's call us star-crossed." Firmly, Ken answered, "Betty, give me time. I'll divorce. For better terms." Betty suddenly stood. "You're a divorce lawyer. Why can't you do it? $2 million a year, isn't that enough? I want your heart, not money." Ken texted me, "The house is yours, I take my son and money." I replied, "I want it all. Don't overdo it. Let's drag it out then." The next time Ken showed up in the camera footage, it was night. Betty, fresh from a shower, hair dripping, wore a see-through nightdress. Despite her stony demeanor, she kept serving him soup and meals. Ken's eyes glued to her, at one point losing control, and trying to hold her hand. She was shocked and rejected him. "What do you take me for, Ken? This is the last soup I'm making for you. Next month, I'm moving back for a matchmaking meet. Don't come again." That night, Ken sat silently in the living room for a long time. "The house and money are yours, and I'll keep our son." I paused, silent for a moment. "Let our son decide who he wants to be with." "Okay, you said it. Don't go back on your word." Ken's tone was firm. I gazed out at the snow-cleared bright sky, my heart slightly tense. To be honest, I'm not too sure about Ethan. He was memorizing things at 3, learning chess at 5, and got tagged as a prodigy by 7. He's always been different from other kids. Never cries or throws tantrums. Although I handle all his daily life stuff, he's not particularly attached to me. I teach psychology and I've looked up cases like this. These kids, with their brains running at high gear, often lag in emotional needs and expression. To him, Ken the nanny, we're all pretty much the same. After I entrusted Ethan to the Go instructor, whenever I went to see him, he just remained absorbed in the game. On the day Ethan had a competition, I dropped him off and went to school for a bit. When I got back, he had quickly beaten his opponent and was doing an interview. I saw Ken and my mother-in-law there. My mother-in-law was beaming, holding Ethan's hand. Ken was confidently chatting with the cameras. He shot to fame because someone recognized him as the prodigy's dad during a high-profile divorce case. It won him their trust. Since then, he's always been Ethan's spokesperson in interviews, which brought him lots of clients. After the interview, Ken whispered something to his mom and walked over to me. Kathy, considering how many years we've been married, I've already given up money and property. Sure, the money's a lot to you, but it's just a year's earnings for me. Ethan would be better off with me than with you. I smiled tightly, biting down my frustration. Did Ethan choose you? He smirked, moving aside slightly so I could see Ethan and his grandma getting into the car. You tell me. I stood frozen, my nails pressing into my palm. Suddenly, the car door swung open, and Ethan climbed out with his backpack, my mother-in-law hurriedly calling after him. With a steady gait like a little adult, he walked straight up to me, looking up to say, I just went to Dad's car to grab my backpack. Mom, you're late. I controlled my emotions, speaking slowly. Yes, sorry, Mom's late. I didn't expect you to win so fast. Ken looked furious, his voice low. Ethan, come with Dad. I got a national coach to train you. Ethan's face was calm. But aren't you divorcing Mom? He said. If so, I can't go with you and Grandma. He took my slightly trembling hand. Let's go, Mom. I need to get back. There's another game tomorrow. I lifted my head slightly. Of course, son. Ken stood there looking furious. In the car, I steadied my shock and excitement, carefully choosing my words. Ethan, do you really understand what it means for Mom and Dad to divorce? From the back seat, Ethan answered me in a young yet steady voice. Yes. Are you upset? My teacher says never to be sad about the spaces you lose on a game board. My eyes welled up suddenly. I always assumed he didn't get love or feelings. Turns out I was wrong. Not showing it doesn't mean he doesn't understand. To an expert like him, he only focuses his most precious energy on what's happening now. When the environment favors him, he doesn't overly invest. But as soon as it changes, he can instantly assess and choose. My son Ethan, he's a natural at this. When Betty, in her see-through nightgown, teary-eyed, threw herself into his arms to say goodbye, Ken finally lost control. He roughly ripped apart the already flimsy fabric. Scooping up the limp, water-like Betty, he strode step by step into the bedroom. I switched off the camera feed. Dave didn't let it go, messaging me. Your husband's holed up in that room all day and night. Want me to catch him in the act? No need. It's gotten to this, and you don't want to vent? Do you actually want to let them get away with this? You don't get it. They need to be together for me to get my revenge. 2 days later, Ken and I headed to the Civil Affairs Bureau to finalize the divorce. The house, money, and our son all mine. He walked away with nothing but looked oddly refreshed. I mean, he'd abstained for half a year, and finally got a taste, like rain after a drought. As we walked out, he glanced at me disdainfully. Kathy, do you think you won? You probably don't know, but next year, my law firm's bringing on new partners and expanding. My profits will double. What you fought so hard for isn't even 1 year of my earnings. And as for Ethan, he might be young and clueless now, but as he grows, he'll know who can truly help him. Think you can keep him then? Just after saying this, he suddenly lost his footing and fell flat on his face. Embarrassed, he scrambled up, looking oddly at his shoes. I watched him quietly, then chuckled. Congrats if you live to enjoy it. He frowned, ready to say more, but I turned, walking away. Not long after, Dave intentionally barged in with friends during their oblivious passion, taking photos and threatening them. Ken was in utter disarray, forced to use his last secret $300,000 to hush them up. Betty cried and demanded they marry immediately and lavishly, fearing those hooligans would spread wild rumors. Later, Ken pledged his law firm shares for a $5 million loan, using a part for a 20% down payment on a new place for Betty, and the rest to throw a grand wedding. Before the wedding, Betty messaged me, "Sis, does your word still stand?" Her words were dripping with sarcasm and smugness. I replied, "It stands." On their wedding day, a news story suddenly broke online. The headline read, "Famed divorce lawyer leaves with nothing for love." Comments poured in under it. "Oh my God, this is unexpectedly heartwarming. I'd give up everything just to be with you. Isn't this the once toughest woman? She's finally made it through her hardships and found love. Yeah, she's moral and upright. She got divorced and then looked for love. Nothing wrong with that. Still, the ex might feel a bit wronged. Wronged? I'm actually jealous. She gets the money and the house, leaving a man who doesn't love her. Isn't that freedom? Anyway, for a divorce lawyer to give up his expertise for love, if that isn't love, then what is it?" On the day of the wedding, at its zenith, Betty said with tears in her eyes, "The small boat has sailed through 10,000 mountains." The crowd roared with applause, truly celebrating the couple, including me. 6 months later, I was driving Ethan to the chess club, stuck outside the hospital, when I saw Ken and Betty. They were sitting by the flower bed on the street, holding envelopes, looking a bit dazed. Suddenly, Betty stood up and screamed, "The result's the same. It's not a mistake. Why is my life so miserable?" She said this, then ran off distraught. Ken didn't even flinch, just staring at his feet. After a while, Dave suddenly appeared. He walked over, grabbed Ken by the collar, and punched him hard. Ken fell helplessly to the ground. Dave, furious, said, "Didn't you say $2,000 a month? You owe me 2 months now. Want me to leak those photos and videos?" Ken quietly got up, wiped the blood from his mouth, and whispered, "I'm out of money. I can't pay anymore. Do whatever you want." Dave shouted, "No money. Aren't you the boss? Don't you have dividends? Who are you kidding?" Ken looked up at the sky quietly and said, "I'm sick ALS. Once my partners heard, they pulled out immediately. My stock value barely covered the $5 million loans. I can't work now, no income." Dave in disbelief asked, "No money left at all?" Ken let out a bitter laugh. "If I wasn't sick, that amount of money would be nothing. But..." Tears streamed down his face before he could finish. Suddenly, the back window of the car rolled down. I turned back to see Ethan staring out and called, "Dad." Ken noticed us, shook slightly, then lowered his head and sobbed, "Ethan, Kathy, I'm sick. I miss you. Dad, your collar." Ethan continued. Ken lifted his tear-streaked face and asked in confusion, "What?" "There's a piece of dog poop," Ethan remarked and rolled up the window. Outside, Ken's face was filled with despair and helplessness. After that, I didn't follow up on Ken and Betty's situation. Once the wheels of fate start turning, the ending is already set. Until one day, after Ethan and I finished trying a new dish Auntie cooked, we were digesting in the living room. I've changed how I educate Ethan. Besides teaching him chess, I want him to explore more of life. He pondered and asked, "Mom, are you feeling lonely?" I almost laughed but nodded slowly. "Yes, I hope you spend more time with me." He thought it over and agreed. From then on, after meals, he wouldn't go straight to his room, but stayed to chat and watch TV with me. I was taken aback when Betty's face appeared on the news. She was unrecognizable. She looked haggard, tired, with high cheekbones and thin lips. She was crying to the reporters, "My life is tough. One husband is paralyzed, and this one has ALS. I hope society can help me more." The camera shifted to a bed in a simple room, where a man lay silently staring at the ceiling. It was a nearly unrecognizable Ken. The reporter emotionally stated, "No matter what, Ms. Lynn's spirit deserves our respect. She and her husband united for love. He gave up everything for her, and she didn't abandon him in hard times." Ethan was glued to the man on the screen. "Mom, I want to see Dad," he said. I agreed. 2 days later, when we found the address from the news, I was surprised. It was an old, almost run-down building, worse than Betty's previous place. I held Ethan's hand and went up to the second floor. The door was open, no one there. The furniture was old and the place messy. As we wondered if we were in the right place, a mumbling sound came from the bed in the corner. Ken stared at us with wide eyes. I led Ethan over to him. His eyes welled with tears, whispering hoarsely, "Son." I silently watched him. His eyes were sunken, bones protruding, once sharp eyes clouded and dim. His hair was choppily cut, clearly done without care, his shirt soaked, sticking with bits of vegetables and rice. I could hardly believe this was the once meticulous Ken. He stared at me without blinking. My eyes were full of pain, sadness, regret, despair. I calmed myself and said, "Ethan said he wanted to see you, so I brought him." Ethan took a stack of money from his backpack. "Dad, this is my New Year's money. I want to give it to you," he said seriously. Betty walked in with a sneer, snatched the money from Ethan's hands, and quickly counted it. 20 grand. She glared at me, her voice full of resentment. "Isn't that a bit too little? He left you over 20 million. I just looked at her quietly. "What about the 5 million you got back then? Didn't he buy you a house?" Betty scoffed. "That house? Only 20% of the down payment was paid. How could I possibly afford the mortgage when he's bedridden? I sold it and bought this one. At least I have a place to live. The remaining 80 grand is in the bank. I get just over 1,800 a month in interest. Plus the street subsidies. It's just enough to get by. Kathy, since he's your kid's dad, shouldn't you give some money back?" I laughed. "Isn't it just enough to get by? Didn't you always claim money was the least important thing? If you fell on hard times, you'd come asking me for money. But if I was struggling, would you give me a dime?" I turned to look at Ken, who had been silently weeping, and said calmly, "You once swore over the phone to stay true to love, and you kept that promise. You admire Betty for sticking by a disabled husband, and you've enjoyed the same treatment. Ken, you've gotten what you asked for. So why are you crying?" Ken started trembling all over, letting out a long wail. I took Ethan's hand and left without looking back. As the car drove down the highway, I pondered for a moment and asked Ethan, "Do you blame Mom for treating Dad that way?" I adjusted my emotions and asked him gently, "The teacher said make no regrets when you make a move, or you'll lose everything," Ethan replied. I breathed a sigh and suddenly thought of something, getting anxious. "Son, when you grow up, don't become one of those chasing his wife to the crematory CEO. It's a terrible fate." For some reason, I felt he might have potential in that direction. Ethan looked puzzled. Why would someone go to the crematory to chase a wife? I was at a loss for words, not knowing how to explain. Ethan figured it out on his own. "Got it. You mean like Dad, right? Don't worry, Mom. I'm the chess player." "Chess player?" I didn't understand. Ethan's voice was calm and determined. "A chess player is always responsible for every move. Once a piece is placed, it can never change." Though I found his words a bit cloudy, I believed him. After all, my son Ethan, he's a master.